Hey, I get hungry at 7 o'clock. You need to get back in the kitchen and make me dinner. I want a turkey sandwich with tomato and pickles.
Make your own darn sandwich.
Social influence refers to the changes in a person's behavior that are induced by the presence or actions of another person or group of people. And there's many different kinds of social influence that tend to occur. And you can rank order them in terms of how powerful they are. And by powerful, I just mean the more powerful the influence is, the greater the amount of change in that person's behaviors or beliefs. So one of the weakest forms of social influence would be mere presence. Now, mere presence, that just refers to the fact that simply being around other people, being in an environment that has other people in it, will result in changes in your behavior. Just imagine like the way you would act in a crowded subway car or a crowded bus versus how you would act when you're alone in that same kind of environment. So that's the effect of mere presence, and it comes in many different ways. Like one effect it can have is called social facilitation, where you can see like a increase in your performance, like a positive effect on your performance, or sometimes it can be negative simply because other people are with you. So here's how that basically works. If other people are present and you are trying to accomplish a task that you are very good at, like it's a very simple task or it's just something that you have a lot of skill at doing, you'll actually see an increase in your performance. You'll actually be even better because other people are watching you. On the other hand, if you're trying to do a very difficult task, something that you don't have a lot of experience with, then the presence of other people can make it even harder for you to accomplish that task. And if you don't have a lot of experience giving, speeches, you'll definitely notice that kind of negative facilitation. You'll notice that when other people start watching you, because this is a very hard thing for you, because you don't have a lot of experience with this, once other people start watching you, your performance will just basically hit rock bottom. Sometimes I've seen people like freeze up and just start stuttering like crazy because they can't handle the fact that other people are, witnessing their speech. Another effect that mere presence can have is called social loafing. So social loafing is something that we tend to see more so in individualistic cultures like ours. You don't really see it in collectivistic cultures like Japan or China, for example. But it's this tendency to put forth less effort when you are working with a group than when you would work alone. So you commonly see this kind of effect in situations where the individual amount that each person contributes is kind of hard to tell. So it's hard to tell how much effort each person put into this group project. And that's why a lot of students hate group projects, because you always get that one guy or those two people in your group that just don't do any of the work. They just expect you to pick up the slack. And you do commonly see this kind of effect in people with a low need for achievement. And one final thing I wanted to mention about mere presence is the study of proxemics. So proxemics is the systematic study of how humans use personal space, especially when it comes to social situations. So because of proxemics, because of research into this field, we know that we tend to put people of different kinds of social groups into different regions. If you've ever heard people talk about how they have like a bubble, and if you get too close to them, that makes them uncomfortable. It's like you've popped that bubble. Well, that's what proxemics is. It's just how we use our personal space. And here's the basics of how it works. When you are giving a speech, when you are talking to a large group of people, you generally want to stay at least about 3.6 meters away. Because beyond 3.6 meters, that's like the audience zone. That's where you want to put your audience. Inside that 3.6 meters till about 1.2 meters from you, like 1.2 to 3.6, that's your social zone. That's where you're just going to put normal people, like acquaintances, strangers. This is basically people in this region are close enough for you to potentially shake their hand or have a polite conversation with, but they're not so close that it starts to feel uncomfortable. Once you get beyond 1.2 meters, so in between about 45 centimeters and 1.2 meters, that's like the friend zone. So that's where you put people that you are comfortable with. I like to say this is basically like the hugging zone. So somebody in this region, you can easily like lean forward and give them a nice big hug or something like that. And then inside 45 centimeters, that is our intimate zone. And I'll let you figure out what you can do inside that intimate zone. Now, a kind of social influence that's stronger than mere presence would be conformity. Now, conformity refers to changing or adopting a behavior or belief in the effort to be consistent with social norms or the expectations of a group of people. Now, in most cases, conformity isn't a bad thing. In most cases, we expect people to conform and we reward them. We give them kind of like social reinforcers if they do conform. So what I'm saying is most of the time conformity is definitely a good thing, but it kind of clashes with our cultural values. It clashes with our beliefs in this country. Like in this country, we're told from a very early age that we're all beautiful and unique snowflakes, and we need to, think for ourselves and make our own decisions. If you've ever heard the phrase, this is something a lot of parents tend to say in this country for some reason, if all your friends jumped off a bridge, would you too? Well, that's kind of like the mentality that we have here, and it really does not make much sense. Because if you look at people, if you study people from a more scientific perspective, what you'll see is massive amounts of conformity. People are conforming from a very early age to well into their adult life. People never really stop conforming. It's just natural. Just as an example, when you are driving a car, you're going to conform. You will fit in. You will do what other people expect you to do, because if you don't, you could die. Like, you could get into an accident. That's probably not going to work out too well. So conformity is typically what we do. It's normal. So I mentioned that a lot of times what we conform to are called social norms. So a social norm, that's just an accepted but usually unspoken standard of what is appropriate behavior in a specific kind of situation. You can think of a social norm as just a rule that tells us what is the normal way of behaving. One of my favorite social norms to talk about is elevator behavior. So when you get into an elevator, we know, nobody ever told us, but we know that we're supposed to face forward, stand still, and not talk. So you just stand there like this and you wait for your elevator ride to end, and then you exit. Well, next time you get into an elevator, you should see what it's like to violate a social norm. So the next time you get into an elevator, turn 90 degrees, stare at the person next to you, and maybe start talking to them very loudly. It's going to get really creepy in that elevator really fast. You're going to feel it. Everybody's going to feel it. You are not supposed to violate this kind of social norm. It's unacceptable. Something similar to social norms are social roles. So this is another thing that we tend to conform to. A social role is a set of behaviors, a set of beliefs that we have socially defined as appropriate, as expected of people who have certain kinds of status. So like we expect doctors to act a certain way, we expect lawyers to act a certain way, police officers, and so on. So depending on the role you play in society, we have social norms for you. So when you accept that role, when you take on that role, then we have these kinds of conformity pressures acting on you. If you want to see a great example, one of the first studies that looked into the power of social roles, you should check out Philip Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment. But there's basically two kinds of roles that people can adopt. You can be ascribed a role. So that just means a role was given to you without your consent. You really didn't have any control over it, and as a result, you have to conform. You have to change your behavior in order to match it. Now, most of us are, at birth, we're assigned a few basic roles, like the role of either a boy or a girl, or the role of, a person of a different kind of ethnicity. But that's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking more about roles that you acquire later on, like if you're drafted into the army, we have certain expectations for soldiers. If you are arrested and put in jail, we expect you to act a certain way because now you've been ascribed that role of a prisoner, and so on. So that's one kind of role that we can have. Another one would be an achieved role. So these are roles that we have to work for, roles that are generally things that make us look good, make us seem more powerful, or have a higher level of social importance. It's just when you have to voluntarily engage in some activity to gain this kind of social status. That would be examples like doctors or professors or whatever. But the dark side, the thing that our culture tends to focus on when it comes to conformity, is the thought that you could lose your individuality. This is something that actually can happen and does happen when people conform. It's called de-individuation. So de-individuation is just when you lose a sense of your personal identity. Like you don't really feel like an individual anymore. You just feel like you're part of something bigger. You're part of something greater than yourself. So even though you lose your personal identity, what you gain is called a social identity, and that actually, in many ways, is healthy. That in many ways is actually good for you. If you remember when I was talking about health and stress in a previous video, I mentioned that being a part of something bigger than yourself, whether it's a spiritual thing or a social group, that can actually help you deal with the harmful effects of stress. So if you do get drafted into the military, or if you join the army or something like that, if you start to identify with your fellow soldiers and you kind of lose your sense of a personal identity, that's not really a bad thing in most cases. That's actually healthy. That's what you should do. You don't want to be an individual in the middle of a battlefield. You want to be part of a group. You want to be part of your fellow soldiers. But perhaps one of the most harmful things, one of the things that can cause the most severe negative consequences when it comes to conformity, is something called groupthink. Now, groupthink is something you see in a group that's highly conforming to each other, where they will suppress their critical thinking skills. They'll suppress their own judgments in an effort to maintain, a cohesive group. It's like, here's an example. Let's say the leader of a group says, I think we should go do, whatever. Like, he has this idea, and it's a ridiculous idea, and nobody would ever want to do that. It's clearly ridiculous. Well, all the other members of that group, they're going to look at each other, and they're all going to say, that's a great idea. Of course we should do that. You're such a smart leader. Like, none of them probably want to do it. All of them probably realize how stupid of an idea this is. But none of them want to say anything, because if they say something, then they might be sanctioned. They might be punished. They might receive some kind of social punish, like maybe they won't get invited to the next group meeting, or maybe they could actually get fired if it's a workplace, or something like that. There have been a lot of really interesting studies on conformity, but I just wanted to talk about a couple. The first one is called the autokinetic effect study, and that was conducted by Muzaffar Sharif. And with this study, what the participants had to do was simply judge how far a point of light moves that is being shown on the wall. So it's a pretty simple study, and any of us can do it with relative accuracy. But remember, it's a study of conformity, so we have to have more than one participant at a time. So they had like 4 or 5 different individuals all sitting down and making these judgments in full view of each other. Like one person would make a judgment and everybody would be able to see that person and hear them make that judgment. Now, what the participants didn't know is that in their group, they were the only real participant. The other participants were actors. We call them confederates in research. So the way it would work is, first all of the confederates would make their judgments, and then the last person to make their judgment would always be the real participant. So here's what they found. The first part of the study, the confederates were all instructed to make accurate judgments. And they did. And then when they got to the participant would also make an accurate judgment. But then in the second part of the study, they stopped moving that little laser. They stopped moving the little point of light. So now, if you were to make an accurate judgment, you should say 0. Like the light didn't move, right? But that's not what the Confederates did. The Confederates were told to keep making, judgments of distance. Like they were told to basically just make up some amount of distance that they, believe the light has moved. So even though the light didn't move, all of these participants, all of these Confederates, would all agree that, it moved like 8 inches or 9 inches or something ridiculous like this. Now imagine you are that participant. Imagine up until now, all these other people have been making good judgments. But now, you clearly saw that light didn't move, and yet they are all telling you, they're all agreeing that it's moved some great amount of distance. If you're that participant, if you're one of the participants in this study, there's going to be a lot going through your mind. If we start measuring your autonomic nervous system, your fight or flight response, your galvanic skin response, what we're going to see is that your heart rate's going to go up, your breathing rate's going to go up, you're going to start sweating. This is driving you crazy. Like, is there something wrong with me? Why is everybody kind of crazy? Am I the crazy one, or are they all crazy? Like, there's so much going through your head. These participants are under such a high level of stress, and the only way they can alleviate that stress is by going along with the group. So that's what you tend to see. Even though the real participant, clearly saw the light didn't move, they would almost always agree with the Confederates. So the Confederates, simply by having a few individuals agree on something that's clearly false, they could easily get these participants to agree with the false judgments. So that's one interesting study. Another one was done by Solomon Asch. So with Solomon Asch's study, it's a similar setup, except now instead of just like 3 or 4 Confederates, now we have 6. So just imagine you're sitting at a big table. You're at one end of the table, and all the way around the other end we have 6 other people. Now the researcher comes out and displays some lines to you that look a bit like this. Now the question is, which one of the lines on the right matches the one on the left? And he goes from person to person around the room. So first person says, oh, it's A. Second person, A. Third, A. Fourth, A. Fifth, A. And then sixth, A. So all 6 of these people all agree that it's A. If you're that 7th person, if you're the 7th person sitting at that table, the only real participant in this case, you can clearly see it's not A. But you really doubt yourself at this point. You think that you might be going crazy. You think that there might be something wrong with your vision. Like you have no idea what's going on, but that intense social pressure to conform will most often get you to also choose A, even though B is the clear right answer. So conformity can have some powerful effects, but it's not as powerful as compliance in most cases. So compliance refers to acting in accordance with the direct requests of others. There's a lot of important factors that play a role in compliance. In general, we're more likely to comply if the request comes from somebody we know, and this is somebody that we kind of like owe a favor to, and if what they're asking us to do is consistent with things we've done before. And there's a few different techniques you can use to get people to comply with your requests. Some of the common techniques you tend to see used by various kinds of salesmen would be things like the foot in the door effect, where first you get somebody to agree to, a tiny little request, but then either later on, like maybe the next day or just later on in the conversation, you start to ramp that up. You start to ask them for increasingly larger and larger requests. So before you know it, you get them to agree to something that they never would have agreed to in the first place because, of that consistency that I mentioned before. Another really effective technique is called the door in the face technique. So this is where you start the conversation with an exceedingly large request, an outrageous request, something that people will never really agree to at the beginning of a conversation. And you don't expect them to agree to it. Like, the reason you make this outrageous request is because you expect them to be, resistant. You expect them to slam the door in your face. That's why it's called this. But the thing about human behavior is that whenever we reject somebody, whenever we deny a request, it kind of makes us feel guilty. It makes us feel a little bad. So what these salesmen do is first they get you to reject them so that you feel that guilt, and then they'll say something like, wait, if you don't want to try this thing, maybe you could just try this, smaller thing instead. So first they make you feel guilty, and then they give you a way to get out of that guilty feeling. And this little thing that they are trying to give you to appease your guilt is actually what they expected you, or that's what they wanted you to do in the first place. So they never expected you to do the big thing. They just always wanted you to do that little one. And then the last technique I wanted to mention is called the lowball technique. So this is where you get a person to initially commit to an agreement with desirable terms. You can definitely see this in effect when you go to buy a car. When you go to buy a car, you're going to see the sticker price, and the salesman will say, we can get it for you at that price. And then you agree, you shake hands, maybe you sign some papers, and then you go sit down and you talk to him, or you talk to somebody else, and then you're kind of like shuffled around all over the place. And it seems like the price keeps getting ramped up and ramped up and ramped up. But you've already agreed to buy the car. It's just now, for some reason, these terms are changing. These terms are becoming less desirable. And before you know it, when you agreed to buy a car for, like $20,000, you wind up, spending $27,000 or $28,000 by the time you get out of there. So these are just a few basic compliance techniques that are sometimes used in, persuasive attempts. So persuasion, that refers to a deliberate attempt to influence the attitudes or the behavior of somebody else. And I could talk at great length about persuasion. I could give an entire, presentation just on persuasion. But I'll try to keep it simple. Persuasion has 4 parts. It has 4 elements. The first one is the source. So who is presenting this persuasive argument? Second one would be the audience. Who is this persuasive argument being directed towards? Third would be the message. So what's the content of that argument? And fourth would be the medium. So how is that argument being presented? Is it, like through the internet or through the telephone or in person? Like, just what's the medium? In order for a persuasive message to be effective, we know that the source of that persuasion, the individual presenting the persuasive argument, they have to be likable, expressive, trustworthy, an expert on the topic, and similar to the audience in some respect. It's really no mistake that I have all of my degrees right here. I always have it in the video because I know that simply having these on the wall behind me will get you to trust me a little bit more when I'm talking about things related to my degrees, which is psychology. And it's also no mistake that I'm wearing this shirt today. It's obviously a joke, but you get the point. Just by showing you that I have some level of expertise on this topic, you're a bit more likely to be persuaded by the things that I'm saying. When it comes to the audience, when it comes to you in this example, we know that the persuasive message will be more effective if I present both sides of the argument to a well-informed audience. So if you're talking to an audience that knows a lot about the topic, you need to present both sides, or else you'll seem to be biased. But you really need to know your audience, because if your audience doesn't know a lot about the topic, then you shouldn't present both sides. So when you're dealing with an audience that has less information, presenting both sides will make you seem uncertain or confused or something like that. Another interesting thing about knowing your audience is that if you know your audience has an average of lower IQ, then in general they're going to be more easily persuaded. The message itself will be more effective if it appeals to emotions, particularly emotions of fear and anxiety. What goes along with this is that if that fearful, anxiety-producing message can also present you with a way to get out of that fearful state, some course of action that you can take in order to alleviate that fear, then it will be even more effective. So that message just has to clearly state what can happen if you fail to act in accordance with what it's asking you to do, and how that can, result in you suffering in some way. But perhaps one of the most important things to remember about persuasive messages is that the most effective ones are often repeated. So simply repeating a persuasive message over and over again will make it much more powerful. And then lastly, there's the medium that I mentioned. So the power of a persuasive message, the way you craft a persuasive message to make it effective, is highly dependent on how you're presenting it. My favorite example of this is one of the first televised presidential debate, which was versus Kennedy and Nixon. So Kennedy and Nixon, they were talking to each other. They were debating, political topics of the time, and approximately half of the country, watched it on TV because they had just recently, purchased a TV and brought it into their home. The other half, however, they hadn't yet gotten a TV, so they just listened to the debate on the radio. So the interesting thing was, because Kennedy is much prettier than Nixon, because Kennedy looked like a much more confident, a much more composed candidate, the people who watched it on TV were persuaded by Kennedy. Kennedy just looked like what a president should look like. But the people who listened to it on the radio, they had the complete opposite opinion. They thought Nixon had won because Nixon sounded like he knew what he was talking about. He sounded like an authority on, these various topics of the day. So you just need to keep that in mind. Just as a word of advice, if you're trying to persuade somebody and you are pretty, you should probably, have some kind of visualization of yourself while you do it, like a video, perhaps. Persuasive attempts are everywhere. You see it all over the place. You see them in magazines, you see them on TV, and nowadays you see them all over the internet as well. And that's the interesting thing about our, modern times, is that the way we persuade people, the primary way that we try to get people to, buy certain products or do certain kinds of things, is through the internet. And the internet is constantly changing, and we're constantly developing new methods to persuade people in our modern days. One of the most interesting ways is through viral marketing strategies and what I like to call, catered advertisements. So I'm not trying to make you feel paranoid, but if you didn't know this, your internet activity is being tracked. So here's what I mean. Go to Amazon.com or some other similar store like this and just browse for whatever, boots. Just type in boots and look at a bunch of boots. Don't buy anything, just look at them. Then just kind of move on with your life. You might find later on that you get an email from Amazon saying, "Hey, I noticed you were looking at boots before. Are you interested in buying boots?" So they paid attention to what you were doing. But it gets even creepier than that, because I don't know if you've had this experience, but if you go to a completely unrelated website, like maybe you go to Facebook or something like that, you might see down on the corner the same, like an advertisement for the exact same boots you were just looking at. It's like, it's a little, the first time you notice it, it might kind of freak you out a little bit, because a lot of people don't realize that literally everything you do online is being tracked. So they know, they're trying to learn more about you, to craft, to, cater the persuasive messages to you specifically. They don't want to waste their time on advertisements that you would never buy. Like if you're somebody like me, it's a complete waste of time and energy for them to try to sell me tampons. So I actually kind of appreciate, I kind of like the fact that they are tracking me, because now all the advertisements I see online are things that I actually am interested in. Like, I don't want to see tampon commercials. I don't want to see advertisements for, all these weird things that have nothing to do with me. Instead, I'm quite happy to allow them to watch me, because now all of the commercials I see are for like Marvel movies and video games and things like that, stuff that I actually appreciate. So I think it's a good thing. A kind of social influence that's more powerful than compliance would be obedience. So obedience is when you carry out the demands of an authority. So it definitely has that element of an authority figure present. But I want to be very clear about something. When you're obedient to authority, that doesn't necessarily mean you're happy about it. Just because somebody obeys the order of an authority figure, that doesn't mean that they agree with it. So a lot of times when people obey, they obey either out of fear or some kind of blind devotion. So just keep that in mind whenever you hear about, like soldiers doing some horrible thing or whatever. Now, one of the most interesting studies of obedience was done by a researcher by the name of Stanley Milgram. And here's how Stanley Milgram did this research. He would recruit pairs of participants. One of these participants was assigned to be a learner. The other one was assigned to be a teacher. Now, what the participant didn't know is that the only real participant was the teacher. The learner was a Confederate, an actor. He was just pretending to participate in the study. So the real participant, the teacher, was sat down at a big, desk with all these switches. And the teacher was told by the researcher that what they should do is try to teach a series of word pairs to the learner. And every time the learner got it wrong, they would apply a increasingly higher amount of electrical shock. So it'd start with mild shock and then get more painful, and before you know it, like near the other end of the switchboard, you see like XXX, like severe shock, like danger signs, It's things that you probably wouldn't want to do to another person. So, the experiment begins, and the teacher, everything goes normal for a while, and the teacher, doesn't have to shock, but then the learner starts making mistakes. Remember, it's a Confederate. This Confederate isn't actually being shocked, but he's pretending to be shocked. So the Confederate would start making mistakes, and the teacher would have to start shocking him. Initially, it's not a big deal, but like I said, it gets more and more painful as they go on. So that the learner, the Confederate, keeps making mistakes, the shocks get ramped up, and after a while, this Confederate would start pretending to have heart problems and start complaining and getting very vocal and getting very agitated. What you saw at this point in the study is that most of the participants, most of these teachers became extremely uncomfortable. They didn't want to participate anymore. But they didn't simply get up and walk out. What they would do is they would turn to the side, look at the researcher who was standing right next to them in the room, a guy with a white lab coat and a clipboard, and they would say, "I don't think I should continue. I want to stop." All that researcher would ever say is, "Please continue," or "The study requires that you continue." This authority figure, this researcher, didn't force anybody to do anything. He simply asked. He simply told them what to do. And because the participants saw that individual as an authority figure, most of them did, show obedience. Most of them did act in accordance with what this researcher was asking them to do. And what we saw is that most of the participants in the study would go so high up on the switchboard that they would actually appear to have killed the learner. Like, they would keep shocking the guy, even though he was complaining and shouting out in pain. They would keep shocking the guy until he stopped responding, and then they would still keep shocking the guy, even though he was completely quiet past that point. So 2/3 of the participants, about 65% of all the participants, fully obeyed the researcher, despite the fact that they quite clearly were killing somebody in the process. This is kind of disturbing. How could somebody do such a thing? These people clearly have something wrong with them. Well, no, they don't. These participants, the ones that apparently killed this other person, were just random people off the street. Just regular people. There was no real correlation with their age or their gender or anything else. It's really, the research clearly shows that any of us could be one of these participants who would go all the way. So obedience is not something negative. It's not something that only the weak of us have. Obedience seems to be a normal human condition. To be obedient to authority is perfectly natural in most situations. It's just in this study they showed how that obedience can be taken advantage of to do horrible things. The most powerful kind of social influence, though, would be coercion. So coercion is when you force a person to change their beliefs or change their behaviors against their will. We tend to call this like brainwashing. And it occurs in 3 basic steps. So the first step to brainwash an individual is to unfreeze them. So that just means that through abuse, through like physical, emotional, sexual, whatever kind of abuse, you make the person deeply unhappy. You make the person think about their own life, their possible death that's just around the corner. So you put them in a very dark place through this kind of abuse, and that makes them much more willing to be flexible about certain things that they've taken for granted in their lives, like their belief systems and their allegiances to other individuals. So after you beat them down into this kind of weakened state, then that's when you go to step 2. That's when you try to change them. You try to tell them what they should do, what they should think, how they should act, and so on. So you kind of, put your opinions in their head. And if you notice that they are starting to accept the things you're trying to tell them, that's when you do the opposite of an unfreezing. So you move to step 3 by rewarding the individual for making these changes, for agreeing with you. You start, giving them back their freedom, giving them back their, individuality, and so on, because they are, adopting your beliefs. Now, just the very last thing I want to say about social influence is that when you look around the world, you'll see different kinds of social influence in effect in different groups of people. But one of the most interesting examples of pretty much all of these levels of social influence occurring simultaneously would be cult behavior. So a cult includes everything from mere presence to conformity to obedience and coercion and so on. And all a cult is really is an authoritarian group where the leader's personality is always the most important aspect. So the leader's personality is much more important than anything else, even the beliefs that cult, tends to hold. So the members of these cults are expected to give their full allegiance to the leader, who is often regarded as infallible, and to follow that leader's instructions without question. So that's, full obedience to this authority figure. And cult members, especially newer members, are often victimized. They're often abused, beat down into a dark place by the leader and many times the other members as well. So that's the coercion aspect. But a lot of times when it comes to trying to coerce people, what cults will tend to do is they'll try to take a shortcut. They instead of recruiting regular people and beating them down, because that can be quite lengthy and expensive process. Instead, what they do is cults will seek out people who are already beaten down by society. Like maybe they lost their job. Maybe they just moved to a new place and they feel very scared and they don't know what to do with their lives. Maybe their spouse just died, and they've had some major life event that's put them into that dark place. Well, the cults will seek out those individuals and recruit them because they're much easier to coerce. They've already gotten to step 2. Now, if you've ever thought that cults are interesting, I've actually included a link down below to a really good documentary on the Jamestown Massacre. If you're not familiar with that, the Jamestown Massacre is one particularly striking example of the kind of things that cults can do. What happened was the entire cult, because they were showing full obedience to the leader and conformity to the rest of the cult, committed mass murder. So we had hundreds and hundreds of people all kill themselves simultaneously because the authoritarian leader instructed them to do so. And it's an incredibly emotional documentary because this wasn't just a bunch of brainwashed crazy people. These were what appeared to be normal people like you and me. They had families, they had friends, they were all in this together. But when the time came and the leader told them to do this, they complied. They were obedient. And they were so obedient that not only were they willing to kill themselves, but the parents would kill their children before they took their own lives. So yeah, it's really depressing, it's really messed up, but it's also extremely interesting when it comes to social influence capabilities. So if you do think that it's at all interesting how people could be so obedient, how people could be so brainwashed, I definitely recommend you watch the full documentary.